In this video, we're going to learn how do we deploy a React application that was built with Vite using GitHub Actions to GitHub Pages. Now, if we were to follow the guide as it comes from Vite, we would only get so far. We'll get the application deployed, but we're going to run into a lot of issues caused by deep linking and the way that GitHub Pages manages the routes that are coming to it. So we're going to start with the Vite guide, but then we're going to add to it so we can resolve all of those issues. Now, as a reminder, this is the campus events application that we created earlier on when we talked about navigation in React application and when we talked about the React router library. This application has a home page, an about page, events page, and a settings page that requires you to log in first. Now, you also notice as we're switching between the different pages, the URL is updating with that path that we're on. Over here, we see the Vite guide that talks about how do we deploy a static site to any static site hosting services. The one that we're going to demonstrate in this video is GitHub Pages, but you can also use any services like Netlify or Fly.to or Vercel. Now, you notice every time we were running our application, we would run it with the npm run dev, which basically runs a local server on our computer so that we can use the application as if it was hosted. Now, this is not how it would run on a hosting service because at the end of the day, we need to end up with one index.html file and a bunch of assets file like JavaScript files or CSS files that are then sent to the user's browser so that they can interact with the site. Now, to do that, actually what we need to be hosting is the output of whatever comes out of the npm run build command. If I run this, you'll notice that it generated a bunch of files and it created a new folder called dist or destination in which it has our index.html. This file is requesting additional assets or additional files, which is the JavaScript file and our CSS file. These files here have been uglified or minified in such a way that it captures all the code that we've developed, all the styles that we've created, but it uses shorter names so that the files themselves at the end of the day become smaller so that it's faster to be communicated over the internet to the user that requests it, regardless of how fast or how slow their internet might be. If we look at those JavaScript files, you see that it's pretty much not human readable, but this is basically the output of what we've created in our React application. You can see there's a lot more code to it than we've actually written ourselves. That is because it captures also any libraries that we've included. So when we downloaded the React router library, it also takes all of those code into consideration. Now, if you scroll all the way to the end, you might start seeing some of our code, especially if we had any errors because they cannot minify our actual text. So these are the error messages that we've created ourselves. Now, if you were to test the generated files here, you need to run npm run preview. And that will host the application on a different router or on a different port. And this right here, it worked on a different screen. So let me bring it over here. Here we go. Here's our application. Everything is working correctly, but you keep in mind that this is basically you're testing the generated files or the generated build files of your application. Now, this is important to note because this is what we're actually going to be trying to host onto our GitHub pages. There are libraries like GH Pages, which what it does essentially is that whenever you run npm run deploy, it will run the build command and it will capture those files as artifacts and it will store them on a separate branch on your GitHub repository. And then when you go to your GitHub Pages settings, you can then say, I want my build or I want my GitHub Pages to be based off of a different branch than the main branch. Now, we're going to come back to this in a second, but this is the point that I'm talking about right here. So instead of deploying from the main branch, you would select the GH Pages branch that would be generated for you by the other library. That is not what I want to talk about in this video. I want to use normal GitHub Actions and actually create our own custom build actions for when we want to deploy our applications. So now I'm going to start with following the Vite instructions to build our first deployment pipeline, but then we're going to have to make a few fixes at the end so that it actually works for our applications or for any application that uses React Router. The first thing I'm going to need to do is to go to the vite.config.js file, and we're going to add another property called base. Now, what you want the value of this base to be is basically the path or the URL of where the root of your application is going to be. So if this was going to be campusevents.com, then your base is basically going to be the starting point of the application. However, if this was going to be to run on let's say campusevents.com/demo, then you want to put the demo part in the base as well. Now, as you know, any application that we've hosted on GitHub Pages so far always had the organization name .github.io / whatever the name of the repository was, and that in our case was our base URL. So for this particular demo, because I know my repository is called React Nav Demos, I'm gonna have to add that over here. And don't forget the trailing slash as well. I'll go ahead and save this. And if I run npm run dev in my terminal, you see that the local path now has included that base in the URL as well. If I try to open this in the browser, I'll go over here. This is going to be 5173/React Nav Demos. And here we go. You notice how we land on a 404 not found page, which is not what we want. We want our application to load correctly. We'll come back to that later on in the video, but for now, we're going to accept this as a starting point, and we'll continue on with the steps to deploy it to GitHub Pages. Now, the next thing I need to do is to create a GitHub action workflow that describes how we want to deploy the application. To do that, I'm going to create a new folder called .github. That folder is going to contain another folder called workflows, and that is going to contain deploy.yml. Make sure that it's at the root of your repository. And now we're going to start defining our build workflow or our build pipeline for deploying to GitHub Pages. First, we'll give this a name, and we're going to call this Deploy React App to GitHub Pages. The next thing we need to do is to define what are the triggers that will cause this GitHub action to start or to kick in. In that case, these are going to be on any push to the following branches. And in this case, our branch that we want to listen to is the main branch. And finally, we need to start defining what the jobs are going to be. So this is the pipeline block that we're going to use to basically do the deployment. This is going to run on Ubuntu latest, and the steps for it are going to be as follows. The first step, let's give it a name, is to actually check out the code. We want GitHub Actions to be able to see the code itself so that it actually is able to deploy it. This step is going to use one of GitHub Actions pre-built defined commands, if you will, and this is called Actions Checkout, and we're going to use the latest version at this time, which is version 5. All what this does is that it gives our GitHub Actions access to the code that we have. The next step we're going to need is to set up Node.js, and also we're going to use a pre-built GitHub action called setup node, and the latest version at the time is version 6. If you're curious, how do I know the latest versions? If you go to github.com/actions, oops, I made a typo here, actions. These are all the actions that are pre-built for you. So for example, if I look up setup node, you'll see the repository right there, and this is where the GitHub action is being defined. So you can look at the documentation to learn more about it. But if let's see, over here, you see that the latest release was October 13 and is version 6. So I'm trying to use the latest version for all of these. All right, so let's go back here. There's a typo. This is uses, and we've defined the action that it will use. And actions. We need to specify a few settings here. So I'm going to define what is the node version that we want, and I'm going to request the long-term support version, whichever one that is at the time of running the build. And second, I'm going to add another option to allow us to cache our npm packages so that every time we run the pipeline again, we don't have to go fetch the same packages over and over again. If we cache them once, and if the packages versions have not changed, we want to be able to get those from the cache instead so that we can save time in the deployment pipeline. Now that we have an Ubuntu server that has checked out our code and has set up Node.js, the next thing we need to do is to actually install the dependencies, similar to how you set it up on your local computer. So this is install dependencies. And this, instead of checking out one of the pre-built containers, we're gonna run a specific command, which is npm ci or clean install. This makes sure that you're getting the latest version off of everything based on what you have in the package.schlock file here. So you can also replace this with npm install. The best practice for whenever you're using a CI/CD system like GitHub Action is that you actually do or perform a clean install. Next, we need to build the application. So name build app. And for this, we're gonna run npm run build. And as you've seen, this is gonna create another folder called dist, and it's gonna move everything into that folder. So now we need to set up GitHub Pages. So here we'll do setup pages, which will use actions setup, or I think it was configure pages. And we can look up what is the latest version of that. Let's go over here, back to actions, and set up or configure pages. Here it is. Latest version is version 5. So 55. Now, because GitHub Pages is basically gonna try to find an index.html file, we need to copy those artifacts and store them in some location that GitHub Pages can watch or can listen to. Thankfully, there's another pre-built action that we could use for that as well, which is, let me just call this upload artifacts. And this will use actions, upload pages artifacts. And if I'm not mistaken, the latest version of that is 4. Let's see. Upload pages artifacts is version 4. And we're gonna have to tell it that the files are gonna be in this folder. Finally, the last step we have is to actually deploy GitHub Pages. So this is deploy to pages, and this uses actions/deploy pages version 4. Now, we're not fully done yet because there's a lot of things that GitHub Action is gonna need. It's gonna need certain permissions that without explicitly giving it to GitHub Actions, this pipeline is just gonna fail at the first step trying to see the code to begin with. So what we need to do here, I'll scroll all the way up, and we're gonna define certain permissions that we are allowing this code to have. So we're gonna say that as far as the contents goes, we allow you to have a read permission. As far as the pages go, we're gonna give you a write permission. And there is something called the ID token, which we also need to give them write access to, which basically means that this job here is allowed to have GWT tokens generated from GitHub and returned from GitHub. All right, so now that we've given it the permissions, we need to define the environments that this is gonna actually deploy. So we're gonna create another property here called environment. This will have the name of GitHub Pages. And next you need to define where is this environment going to be hosted on. Now you can hard code this value for your particular project, but probably the best practice here is to actually get a dynamically generated value out of the GitHub action itself. And to do that, I'm going to go down to the deploy step. I'm actually going to give it an ID or a name of deployment, which would allow me to go into the URL, and I'm going to actually inject the URL out of what comes out of GitHub Pages itself. So this step here is actually aware of GitHub Pages URL, and it will capture it, and it would allow me to read it into this step back here. So this will be get the steps, get the deployment step, and I want you to get the outputs, particularly the page URL. Now let's try to push this to GitHub Actions and see if it works correctly. So this will be setup GitHub Actions for GitHub Pages deployment. We'll go ahead and commit and push. I'll switch over here. I'll go into our repository, If I refresh, you see that the GitHub Actions has kicked in. If I go to Actions, we see that it's trying to deploy something. Okay, it looks like it failed, maybe right away, or maybe too soon actually. But it's also still trying to run the GitHub Pages build and deployment. This one we have not developed ourselves. This is the one that comes out of GitHub Actions itself or GitHub Pages itself. So I'll have to go to settings and I'll have to go under pages, and we'll make sure that we're not deploying from a branch. We're actually using GitHub Actions for our deployment. Now that we've updated that, hopefully next time we make a push, this here is not going to actually trigger and it's not going to try to deploy anything. Let's click on this here and see where did it fail. Probably failed because the other one was trying to deploy at the same time, or that I made a typo. Looks like it says it was unable to resolve the action, which is actions upload pages artifacts. Let me go back and see what it was called. Upload pages artifact, not artifacts. So if I remove the S, that should take care of this. I'll go ahead and commit it. Fixed the typo. Commit and push. Let's go back to our GitHub Actions here. We see that there is another one that's kicking off to start. You see, these are all the different steps that we've defined in this one deploy job that we created. I can click on this and we would be able to see step by step all the steps that we've defined. So as you can see, checked out the code, set up node, installed the dependencies, built the application, it configured pages to get started, uploaded the artifact into this location, and deploying to GitHub Pages. Looks like everything worked correctly. So now let's go back to basically where the page is hosted. If I click on command and open it, here we go, the page is running. But similar to what we also saw when we landed locally, we also got this error 404, not found, but the application is still working as we expected to. Notice how the URL is kind of incorrect. That is your first tell to understand why the URL didn't work correctly. We know this is not the correct path for our campus events application. It should be /react nav demo. So there's something that we're going to have to do with the React router locally on our computer first. Another tell, if I copy this URL here, and let's say I'm on the events page and I want to navigate to that page again, if I just paste that in, we're actually going to land on this 404 that is generated not even by us, but by GitHub Pages, saying that we don't know of a web page that is it3049c.github.io/about. So now let's go back to our code and let's make some fixes here. So I'll go back to our main.jsx file, which is under source. And now we need to instruct the browser router here that the base for it is not actually just a regular slash. It's actually going to be whatever the URL for our page is. So at the bottom of the array here, we're going to create another object. We're going to provide a property called base name. And our base name is actually configured at Vite. So one of the ways that we can actually extract this dynamically from our Vite configuration is to use the following: import meta.environment, and the environment variable name that we're looking for is base URL. Let's go ahead and save this. And if I switch back to our locally run application, you notice that when we're on the React Nav demos page, we did not land on the error page any longer. We landed on the proper home page. And as we navigate between the different pages, all of these are appended to the full path name or to the base URL that we had, which was React Nav demos. Now let's go ahead and push this fix and see if that fixes all of our problems here. Updated the base name for the browser router. Commit and push. Let's go back to our GitHub Pages or GitHub Actions and await the completion of this step here. All right, so let's see what we get here. If I go back to, let me actually close this all together. I'll go back to our root or to our repository. And let me show you this real quick. You can click on this cog icon here and add your GitHub Pages URL to the repository details, which will make it appear over here, kind of an easy way to find your GitHub Pages URL. If I click on this, all right, maybe this did not refresh yet, so let's actually trigger a hard cache reload. Now, as you can see, we're on the home page, not the error page any longer. We go to the about page, everything is working correctly as we expect it to. Now, here's the moment of truth. Let me copy this URL. And if I am on the about page and I navigate to this page and hit enter, we still land on file not found. Now, this is one of the classic SPA or single page applications issues that occurs when you try to deploy this to GitHub Actions. What actually happens when you navigate to this URL is that GitHub Pages does not look into this application and tries to figure out if this application has another path to navigate you to. Instead, what it tries to do is that it looks for events/index.html, which is why you get this file not found. And when it doesn't find this URL, it tries to look for a 404.html file on your own repository. And when it doesn't find it, it actually lands on its fallback file not found page that's generated by GitHub Pages. Now, as you can see, when we actually tried to go to /events, we didn't even land into our application altogether. It just tried to look for an index file or an events.html or events/index.html file. So we did not even get to be in the React application to begin with. So what we need to do is to trick GitHub Actions in a way to have it fall back into a 404 page that is actually the index.html page that we have. That way, if it tries to navigate to a page that does not exist, it will land on our page, which will trigger our React code to kick in, and then it will navigate you to the React application. Let's see that in action real quick. So I'll switch back to my deploy pipeline here, and after the build, let's go ahead and add another step, and let's call this create 404.html from our index.html. And this is very simple. All it's really gonna do is that it will copy our dist index.html into dist./404.html. So now both of these files are exactly the same thing. Both of them are gonna kick React in, and we'll be able to navigate into the page that we want using our React router after that. So let's go ahead and save and deploy. Fake 404.html to kick in React. And push. Let's wait for the GitHub Actions to finish. All right, so now let's go back to our page here and let's actually refresh this view, because that should kick in our 404 and should get our React application to route us to the correct page. If I hit reload, here we go, we landed on the correct page. If I do the same thing and try to navigate to the /about page, here we go, everything works correctly. This is all great, but now I have one little trick that we can add so that we can make this deployment action here something that is generic enough that we can use on any of our projects. The crucial step that you may remember here is that we had to specify, or we had to define, what the base was in our vite.config.js. That is the same value that later on in the main.jsx file we had imported. That is what was passed into the base URL here. Now we would learn, if you go through the documentation, that you could also run your build command using a CLI argument called base. So if I do build --base equal whatever that URL was, so this was React nav demos, and don't forget the trailing slash, and hit enter, it's gonna build the application correctly. And if I try to preview it using that base, it's gonna still work correctly as we expect it to. It did open on my other window here, so let me bring it back over here. So that means I can keep that vite.config file as generic as I want it to be, and as long as I'm able to pass it correctly into my build, then all should be good. So what I'm gonna need to do now is I'll switch back to my deploy.yml and we'll find the step where we did the build, and we're gonna need to pass that in as an argument. So base equal something. That something is what we need to be able to figure out how do we extract. So for that, I'm actually gonna make this to be a multi-line command. So if I do the pipe command and hit enter, I can start having multi-lines for my script here. GitHub Action has access to all the information or all the meta information about the repository. Particularly the one I'm interested in is called github.repository. So I'm gonna create an environment variable. I'll call this repo name, and this will equal whatever comes out of this command here. This is gonna be echo, and we want you to inject the value from GitHub Action. This value happens to be github.repository. Now, the problem with github.repository here is that it also includes the owner name in the value. So if you're running this on my organization, it would be IT3049C/the repository name. If this was on your personal account, it would be whatever your username is /the repository name. So effectively, we need to extract that piece out and only capture whatever comes back after the slash. So we're gonna use some Linux commands here to extract that out. So I'm gonna do cut, and I want you to cut it at the delimiter, that is the /, and I want you to output the second argument or the second value that comes after the slash. So if the first one is whatever came before the slash, number 2 would be whatever comes after the slash. We just make sure that we wrap all of this here in double quotes, remove those spaces. Sometimes Linux can be very particular about those things. And now over here, I'm gonna need to inject whatever the value of repo name is. Now let's save. So let's just recap what we're doing here. We are removing the base from our configs, from our Vite config, and we're only gonna inject it through a environment variable that we're passing into our npm run build. So whenever we run this locally, everything is gonna be back to what it used to be, which is running at the root of your server. So if I run dev, this is gonna be at the root. There is not gonna be a base name provided after that. Let's kill this and let's push final push to GitHub Actions. Hopefully this all works. Switch over to the repository, go to Actions. Here's the commit, and let's watch whatever happens here. You notice at the build step here, it did capture whatever the value is, and it passed it later on in the build command to Vite. So that is what we have provided over here. Let's see if this all worked. If I refresh, this should work. Let's refresh it again. Let's go to the root. All right, so we do have some issues. So it looks like it actually injected the text of echo, whatever that is, instead of the result of calculating that. So that is because I missed adding the $sign here. So let me try one more time. Fixed a typo. Commit and push. Come back over here. Let's watch it one more time. Oh, there it is. Let's go back to the application. Refresh. All right, here we go. Everything is working back as expected. If I try to bypass our React router and directly go to /about, it still lands us on the correct page. That concludes this video. Now we're able to deploy our React applications that were built with Vite directly to GitHub Pages using GitHub Action. Now, every other hosting service that you might be working with may generate a starting point for what this file would look like. Now that you understand what the possible issues that could happen and why do they happen, you should be able to configure it correctly for whatever the hosting service that you're using.